Welcome back again to another broadcast of the Crossbanner Heritage Movement. I'm Brother Derek Henson from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and we appreciate you being here with us again today. You can see the Crossbanner Heritage Movement broadcast on Facebook, or you can find us on YouTube as well. Our mission here is twofold. Very quickly today, we've got a lot to get into. Number one, we're evangelistic. We are here to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, leading the lost to the redemptive cross. Number two, we are exhortative, educating others to the founding principles and the historical heritage of our American Republic. And on that second note today, again, this is number 2 in a series. We hope to at least do 4 this summer of 2016. I teach school, and I've been out of school all summer, like other teachers have been. And we've tried to do book reviews. Now, I know that millennials, too many of millennials, do not read anymore. You may read articles on the internet. You get your news from other sources, maybe TV, media, so forth. You don't read newspapers anymore. Well, as a country, we don't read enough books. So these are 4 books this summer that I have read, enjoy reading. They're part of my library. The first one was on Maximilien Robespierre, who was one of the leaders of the French Revolution of 1789. We did that back earlier in the summer. Today, we are doing Rebel Yell. Rebel Yell. Rebel Yell is the violence, passion, and redemption of Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jonathan Jackson of Virginia. He becomes Stonewall Jackson during the American Civil War, or as I like to call it, the Southern War for Independence. The book is by S.C. Gwynn, and it's a very recent book that has been published. I read it only a year ago and wanted to bring it out to you today. Want to share some things with you from the book today. Now, as we pick up on page 22 through 27, now they're talking about Jackson. Jackson, as a young man, was born in Western Virginia, today the state of West Virginia, grew up in Virginia. Of course, he was around slavery, 1830s, 40s, 50s. But by the time we get to 1859, 1860, as a slaveholder. Now, Jackson and his wife are born-again believers. They're Presbyterians. They live in the town of Lexington, Virginia. As a slaveholder, he was aware of the congressional debate over slavery in the territories, but not deeply versed in it. He was like many ordinary Virginians of his day, a moderate states' rights Democrat who favored keeping Washington, D.C.'s nose out of Virginia's business and working within the Union, within the Constitution, to resolve sectional differences between the states. He had no ideology. He was a Virginian. The cadets that he taught at the Virginia Military Institute, he was a professor. He had fought in the Mexican War. He was now a professor at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. They were part of the great mass of young men who would do most of the coming war's fighting. They had little understanding, the author says, of the freakish political complexity of the Compromise of 1850. They didn't care about those things. They didn't understand those things. They weren't well read of those things. And they could not grasp fully the reasons for the disastrous splintering of the Democrat Party in 1860. They couldn't decide on a single candidate. They ran 2 candidates, a northern candidate and a southern candidate, which almost guaranteed the election of Abraham Lincoln as the second Republican candidate to run for president. Nor would Virginians inclined as a whole to buy the idea that was hawked loudly by the members of the lower South. Virginia was part of the middle South, but the lower South, they were saying that Lincoln's election meant that the federal government was going to free the slaves and forcibly mix the 2 races. That's what the lower South was saying. But the Virginians didn't believe that. They didn't believe that just because Lincoln won that the world was going to come to an end. The world as they knew it, their culture. All right, so what drove them? What drove Virginia? What drove men like Jackson into the arms of secession? The first of those events was an invasion of the state of Virginia. It took place on October the 16th, 1859, a year and a half before the war, and that was John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown led a raid with a group of men, including several of his sons, on a federal arsenal, like we would think of as a National Guard armory, in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He was going to steal the weapons there and start a slave revolt. He had already been involved in Bleeding, Kansas, if you remember that from your high school history days, Bleeding, Kansas. John Brown was a rabid, radical abolitionist. And he believed in a coming war, a race war, where he would lead the black race, the slaves of the black race, with some white abolitionists to sweep away slavery, like the scourge that he saw that it was. And when this happened in Virginia, that opened up many of the eyes of Virginians and people of the Middle South. And so John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry played a big part. 22 through 27, 30 through 31, played a huge part in the encouragement of the upper Southern person to accept secession after the election of Lincoln. Now, the war begins, and Jackson resigns at VMI and becomes a commander of the local Virginia forces. Eventually, they are rolled into the Army of the Confederacy, and he begins to fight for the Confederacy. On page 383, he talks about the necessity of what we know today as total war. Total war did not just come out of World War II. Total war began during the American Civil War. And this is what Jackson had to say. Now, Lee's victories early in the war, 1861 to 1863, they coincided with a pronounced hardening of Northern attitudes. This shift was embodied in the rise of the radical Republican, that wing of the Republican Party, whose beliefs included three fundamental truths: that slaves should be freed, that freeing them could only be accomplished by war, and that the nation's fate could no longer be separated from the issue of slavery. This was the radical wing of the Republican Party. Slaves had to be freed. They could only be freed through war, and that you could no longer separate the issue of slavery from the destiny or the fate of America. And it was Thaddeus Stevens that called for total war. Total war. I encourage you, if you've never seen it, to watch the movie Lincoln, which is about the passing of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Thaddeus Stevens plays a large role in that movie. He began to call for total war. Total war. And in the end, the ruling Republican Party in Congress was radicalized. Radicalized. We talked about radicals in the French Revolution in the book that we did earlier in the summer, and now we're talking about radicals again. The radical Republican wing. Lincoln was not part of that wing. Lincoln had the war almost, what you could say, forced on him by some of the actions of Southern leaders in Charleston and Southern leaders in Montgomery, Alabama. But the war came, and the war was being lost by the North, and it was being won by the South for the first 2.5 years or so of the war. And then Thaddeus Stevens and Congress, one of the major leaders of Congress, says, we must have total war. Total war, because slavery must end. Slavery must end. On 408, the intensity of war. The Virginia yeomanry, the yeoman farmer, began to suffer because of General Pope's harsh conditions now as he begins to take over northern and western Virginia. The tide is turning here, and the North begins to win in Kentucky, in Missouri, in Tennessee, and in northern and western Virginia. And so he makes it harder on the average Virginian living in those areas, as well as in the northern part of the South, westward. By the summer of 1862, the national mood had changed. Southerners were tired of seeing stragglers and deserters. They began to call them dirty villains. And so the intensity of the war, they realized that, and this is what Jackson says, that men cannot be allowed to shirk their responsibility. And that deserters from the cause of the South, the Confederate Army, had to be hung. A colonel in the 10th Virginia, from whose regiment 2 of these deserters came, replied with an icy fury, "Sir, men who desert their comrades in war deserve to be shot, and officers who intercede for them deserve to be hung. For Jackson, straggling and desertion were the ultimate violations of duty." Next came a chaplain with his own gentle plea, and he said to Jackson, "General, consider your responsibilities to the Lord. You are sending these men's souls to hell." And Jackson replied, "That, sir, is none of my business. Do you do yours." And then he handled the chaplain rather roughly, taking him by the shoulders and whirling him around and pushing him out of his tent. Jackson hated deserters with a special passion. He had only restrained himself from shooting them before because public opinion wouldn't tolerate it. By now, they see that the war is going harder. It's going to be that much more difficult to win the war, and so therefore deserters must be shot. On 487, Jackson becomes more of a general in the line of a Joshua of the Old Testament, a David of the Old Testament. He is a Christian general. He did more than just redirect credit for his victories to the divinity. He gave God the honor and the praise for his victories. He did that from Manassas, the first major battle of the war, right until May of 63 at Chancellorsville, when he was shot and later died from pneumonia. Jackson, who believed that godliness among his troops would win the war, and by contrast blasphemy such as carrying mail on Sunday could doom the cause, he began to play a more active role in his army's religious life. He worked behind the scenes to produce Christian pamphlets that were distributed, to have Bibles bought and distributed, to encourage the men to attend services whenever they could, Sunday school services, worship services in the mornings and at night, any time they could. And he believed that godliness and that being godly among the soldiers of the army could contribute to winning the war. A Christian general in the line of David or Joshua. And he believed that the mission field was not just for the foreign country, but you're in a mission field wherever you are. Jackson is one of those, like David and Joshua of the Old Testament, who believed that he could serve the cause of Christ by serving his country and winning this war and creating a southern republic where religion and Christian faith was more profound and more natural than in the northern states. And as we come to a close this week, Rebel Yell, this book about this great Christian general, his death was at his greatest victory. It was like a Greek tragedy. Robert E. Lee, this great Christian moral general, and Jackson, his right arm, they go into Chancellorsville. They win the greatest victory of their time together, and Jackson is shot and killed tragically by troops of his own army. And for me personally, they were troops from North Carolina. And those troops led directly to him losing his arm and eventually, weeks later, dying from pneumonia. It's a great book. Check it out. Rebel Yell, the story of Stonewall Jackson. Until next time, this has been the Christian Heritage, Crossbanner Heritage Movement broadcast. Pick us up on the internet, Crossbanner Heritage Movement.